Don't move. Don't speak. The voice cut through the hallway on the 47th floor like a blade through silk, and Billionaire Vesper Vale froze mid-step. The man who had just blocked her path was not security. He was not police. He was Callum Roar, a single father who mopped floors on the night shift. Vesper turned toward him with the kind of cold precision that had built an empire. "Did you just give me an order?" Callum said nothing. His eyes were locked on the diamond bracelet circling her wrist. "Now," Vesper laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. Then Callum lifted one finger toward the security camera mounted above them. 3 seconds, he said, and you die. The laughter died in her throat, and when the camera above them flickered to black, Vesper understood for the first time in her life that the poor man standing in front of her knew a secret no one else on earth was supposed to know. Callum Roar was 39 years old, and to the men and women who walked the marble floors of Vale Dominion Tower, he barely existed. He wore grey coveralls that had faded from 100 washes. He carried a cart with wheels that always needed oil, and he pushed it through the same corridors night after night, past glass offices where fortunes were made and lost in the space of a single phone call. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then only a handful of words, chosen carefully, never wasted. He never complained about the late hours, never argued with the executives who occasionally snapped at him for standing in their way, never asked for more than what the job required. To most people in that building, he was furniture, a shape that emptied trash bins and buffed floors and disappeared before sunrise. But Callum had one habit that no one ever noticed, because no one ever looked closely enough to notice anything about him at all. He watched the cameras mounted in every corner, memorized the rhythm of every door, tracked the subtle shift in light when a panel malfunctioned for even half a second. He watched the small, almost imperceptible details that separated an ordinary night from a night when something was about to go terribly wrong. That night, Vesper Vale, 37 years old and chief executive of Vale Dominion, returned to the 47th floor after an emergency board meeting that had ended in raised voices and folders slammed shut against polished wood. She was the kind of woman entire rooms rearranged themselves around, cold, exacting, utterly certain of her own control, the sort of presence that made junior staff lower their eyes without being told to. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped out expecting an empty corridor, the same corridor she had walked 1,000 times before without incident. Instead, Callum was already there, standing directly in her path, as though he had known the exact second she would arrive. She stopped, more from irritation than fear. "Move," she said, the word clipped and final. Callum did not move. "Don't speak," he answered instead, his voice low and even, carrying none of the deference she was used to hearing from anyone beneath her on the payroll. Vesper assumed for one brief moment that the man had lost his mind, that perhaps the stress of the building's late hours had finally worn something loose inside him. She glanced toward the empty hallway behind him, calculating how quickly she could summon help if this went further than words. But then his gaze dropped deliberately to the bracelet on her wrist, the one she had barely thought about since a gala 3 nights earlier. Something in the way he studied it, unhurried and precise, made the irritation in her chest curdle into something colder, something closer to instinct. "That bracelet," Callum said slowly, "is not jewelry." Vesper looked down at the diamonds catching the hallway light, at the delicate chain she had worn 100 times without a second thought, a gift she had accepted with a smile and forgotten by the following morning. "Then what is it?" she asked, and for the first time in years, her voice wavered just slightly, betraying a crack in the armor she had spent her whole career perfecting. Callum's answer came without hesitation, flat and certain, the words of a man who had said far worse things in far worse rooms, in a life he no longer spoke of. "A trigger." Callum told her not to move her wrist, not to touch the clasp, not to call for security. Not yet, not until he understood exactly what they were dealing with, and not until he was certain the threat had not already changed shape. Vesper's instinct, sharpened by decades of boardroom warfare, told her this was some kind of extortion, a setup engineered by a rival to shake her composure before an important vote. She glanced past him toward the glass doors at the end of the corridor, the ones overlooking the city's endless grid of light. Outside, everything blinked in its usual indifferent pattern. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed wrong. And for one breath she allowed herself to believe this stranger had simply lost his nerve, his job, and now perhaps his mind. And then it happened. A soft click, barely audible, echoed from somewhere near the ceiling, so faint that a person with ordinary instincts would have missed it entirely, swallowed by the building's constant hum of air vents and distant elevators. Callum did not miss it. In one motion, he pulled Vesper sideways, out of the direct line between the glass door and where she had been standing only a heartbeat before, his grip firm but exact, no wasted force. A small metallic object punched through the reinforced glass panel at the end of the hall, embedding itself in the wall exactly where her chest would have been standing. Vesper's breath caught somewhere between her throat and her lungs, refusing to move in either direction, her mind struggling to process what her eyes had just confirmed. Callum did not flinch. He did not reach for a phone, did not raise his voice, did not so much as blink at the small crater now punched into the wall beside them. He simply scanned the hallway once, twice, as though confirming something he had already suspected long before he ever stepped in front of her. "Who are you?" Vesper managed, her voice thinner now, stripped of its usual command, the polished executive replaced for one raw moment by someone simply trying to breathe. Callum met her eyes for the first time since the elevator doors had opened, and something in his expression carried both weariness and resolve, the look of a man who had hoped never to need these instincts again. "The man who just saved your life," he said, and there was no pride in it, only fact, delivered the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis without embellishment. What frightened her more than the bullet in the wall was the way Callum had known, without seeing a single figure through the glass, exactly where the danger was coming from and exactly where it would land. He had not guessed. He had calculated the way a man calculates something he has calculated many times before. "Did you used to work for me?" Vesper asked, searching his face for some flicker of recognition she might have missed 100 times before, some clue she had simply been too busy to see. Callum shook his head once. "No," he said. Then, after a pause that stretched far too long for comfort, a pause heavy with everything he had not yet decided to share, he added the sentence that would unravel everything she thought she understood about her own company. "But I used to work for the man who wants you dead." Years earlier, before the coveralls and the cart with the squeaking wheel, Callum Rohr had been something else entirely, a specialist in security systems for one of the largest financial institutions in the country, a man whose name once appeared on confidential reports read by people far above his current station. He had spent his days mapping camera networks, tracing data lines, and finding the invisible seams where physical security and digital infrastructure failed to meet, seams most people never even knew existed. He understood buildings the way surgeons understood bodies, every artery, every blind spot, every place where something could go wrong without anyone noticing until it was far too late to matter. Then, after an incident that ended his career in ways he rarely spoke of, and that still tightened something behind his ribs whenever he thought about it too long, Callum walked away from that world entirely. He chose an ordinary life. He became invisible on purpose, trading recognition for peace, ambition for anonymity, and he never once looked back with regret, only with a caution that had settled into his bones and never fully left. That invisibility made him easy to overlook, and easier still to disrespect. Executives who barely registered his presence called him, when they bothered to call him anything at all, simply the janitor, a word tossed carelessly over shoulders as they hurried past toward meetings that would decide fortunes larger than most people's entire lifetimes. One building manager had once reprimanded him for lingering too long in front of a camera panel, certain that Callum was slacking off during his shift, unaware that Callum had just noticed something the manager himself had missed for weeks. No one in that hallway ever imagined that the man mopping floors near the security office was actually cataloging a discrepancy in the feed timestamps, a flaw that would have taken a trained analyst hours to find, and that Callum had noticed in under a minute, filing it away without comment the way he filed away everything. Back in the present, standing amid shattered glass on the 47th floor, Vesper began to understand that the man beside her was not simply skilled. He was fluent in a language of danger that most people never learn to read at all. He knew every camera in the building, every hallway, every exit, every dead zone where the security system's coverage quietly failed, blind spots she had paid millions to eliminate and never once succeeded. "How do you know the man behind this?" Vesper asked, her composure returning in fragments even as her hands trembled faintly at her sides, betraying the fear she refused to let reach her voice. Callum's answer came slow and deliberate, each word placed like a stone across a river, tested before his full weight settled onto it. "I don't know him," he said. Then his eyes drifted toward the broken glass, toward the darkened camera overhead, as though he could see through both of them into something far larger, something that had been building quietly for years without her ever noticing its shape. "But I know the man who's paying him." Callum led Vesper away from the shattered glass and down a service corridor few executives ever used, past unmarked doors and humming machinery, into a small technical room lined with monitors and tangled cables that hummed faintly in the dark. He pointed to a bank of screens showing the 47th floor, then traced his finger along a line of code scrolling silently beneath the footage, code that meant nothing to her and everything to him. The camera outside her office, he explained, had not been tampered with from outside the building. It had been altered from within the network itself, by someone with legitimate access to Veil Dominion's own security infrastructure, someone who had walked through these very halls with a badge and a smile. Vesper's first instinct was to summon her security team immediately, her hand already moving toward the phone in her pocket, muscle memory built from years of delegating problems the instant they appeared. Callum stopped her with a single word: "Wait." If she alerted her people now, he explained, whoever had orchestrated this would know within minutes that their plan had been discovered, and they would simply adjust their approach before striking again, this time without giving her any warning at all. The realization settled over Vesper like a weight she had not braced herself for, the understanding that the danger might not be some outside enemy at all, but someone she trusted, someone who sat across from her in meetings and called her by her first name over coffee she had personally recommended. She pulled up the roster of her board of directors on a tablet, scanning name after name with a suspicion she had never before turned on the people closest to her, faces she had celebrated birthdays with, faces she had trusted with the future of everything she had built. One name made Callum go still. Gideon Wren, Chief Financial Officer of Veil Dominion, a man who had stood beside Vesper for more than a decade through mergers and losses and every quiet crisis in between, a man she had once called, in a rare public moment, the steadiest hand in the room. He was the only person outside her own household who knew her private schedule down to the minute, the only one who could have arranged for a bracelet, a camera glitch, and a hallway to align with such devastating precision. But as Callum dug deeper into the data trail, he found something even more unsettling, buried beneath layers of encryption designed to keep even skilled eyes from wandering too far. Every record connected to the attack had been hidden behind an internal code, one designed not merely to obscure evidence but to protect something Vesper had not yet been told existed, something older and larger than a single failed attempt on her life. Callum studied the pattern for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant to say it aloud. "They don't want you dead," he said finally. Vesper stared at him, her pulse hammering somewhere she couldn't quite locate, the sentence landing wrong in a way she couldn't yet explain. "Then what do they want?" His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, carrying the weight of a truth she was not prepared to hear. "They want your signature on something. Before you die." Back in the technical room, Callum turned the bracelet over in his gloved hand, examining the clasp beneath a small magnifying lens he had produced from his cart without explanation, the kind of tool no ordinary janitor would ever think to carry. It was not, as he had first suspected, merely a signal trigger for the assassin outside the glass. Embedded within the delicate metalwork was a microscopic encryption chip, small enough to escape any ordinary inspection, designed to transmit data the instant it crossed into a specific location within the building, a location Vesper now realized she had walked through dozens of times without ever knowing what it was measuring. Vesper had no idea such a thing was even possible, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure slipped entirely, replaced by something closer to disbelief than anger. She remembered the gala 3 nights earlier, the warm lights, the champagne, the small velvet box placed in her hands by a familiar face she had thanked with genuine warmth. The bracelet had been a gift, and the man who had given it to her was Gideon Runn. Piece by piece, details she had dismissed as ordinary now rearranged themselves into something far more sinister, the way a photograph looks entirely different once someone points out the shape hidden in its shadows. For weeks, Gideon had been quietly pressing her to sign a restructuring agreement, one that would shift a significant portion of ownership control away from her and into the hands of a group of shareholders whose identities remained deliberately vague, hidden behind language so carefully worded that even her own legal team had waved it through without concern. She had trusted his judgment without question, the way she had trusted it for 10 years, the way a person trusts a hand that has never once let them fall. Callum explained that the chip inside the bracelet was engineered to activate the moment Vesper entered a particular zone within the building, likely the very corridor where the assassin had been positioned, the timing calculated down to the second by someone who understood her schedule better than she understood it herself. But one question remained unanswered, and it hung between them heavier than anything else that had been said that night. How did a janitor know the exact specifications of a device this obscure, this precisely engineered, a device most security professionals would never even recognize? Vesper turned to face him fully, her voice sharpening with the demand of someone who had spent her entire career refusing to accept incomplete answers, someone who did not tolerate mystery in rooms she was supposed to control. How do you know all of this? Callum was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, his jaw working slightly, as though weighing exactly how much of himself he was willing to hand over. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness, softened by something closer to old grief than caution. Because I've seen this design before, he said. Vesper pressed further, unwilling to let the sentence hang unfinished. Where? Callum's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he answered, the muscles along his neck betraying tension his face refused to show. In the file of a case everyone believed was already closed. Vesper studied him, sensing that whatever came next would explain far more than a bracelet or a bullet ever could, that this was the door beneath the door she had already opened. Which case? She asked quietly, her voice softer now, almost gentle. Callum looked away from her toward the darkened monitors and said the words like they still cost him something even after all these years. The case that turned me into a single father. Callum did not tell the story easily, and Vesper did not push him to rush it, sensing instinctively that some things could not be summarized without losing their weight, without becoming smaller than the truth deserved. Years earlier, while working in corporate security, he had uncovered a pattern of financial manipulation running through a network of shell companies, one designed so carefully that it took him months to piece together even a fraction of its true shape, months of late nights and quiet suspicion that gnawed at him long before he had proof. He had planned to report it, to hand the evidence to regulators who could act on it properly and dismantle the network before it caused real harm to people who had no idea their savings were being quietly siphoned away. But before he ever had the chance to release what he'd found, the people connected to that network moved first, dismantling his career with a precision that mirrored the very schemes he had tried to expose, turning his own diligence into evidence against him. He lost his position within weeks, his professional reputation collapsed soon after, poisoned by rumors he never had the resources to fight, whispers that followed him from interview to interview until the interviews simply stopped coming. The life he had built for himself disappeared in a matter of months, replaced by something quieter, smaller, and far more careful, a life built around survival rather than ambition. He became a man who lived without drawing attention to himself, not because fear had broken him, but because he understood something few people ever learn early enough to protect themselves from real damage. The more visible a person became, the easier they were to target, the easier their life could be dismantled by people with more resources and fewer scruples than they would ever admit to publicly. Vesper sat with that truth for a long moment, watching him in a new light entirely, no longer as the man who mopped her hallways, but as someone who had spent years quietly circling the same predatory network she had just stumbled into by accident, a hunter who had traded his hunt for a cart and a mop out of necessity rather than choice. Callum had not saved her that night because of money, and he had made no move to suggest otherwise, no hint of expectation in his voice or his posture. He had done it because he refused to let another person be consumed by a system he had already watched destroy something he valued far more than any career, something he still would not name aloud. Vesper studied him for a long moment, the silence between them thick with everything neither of them had said aloud, the kind of silence that says more than either of them was prepared to admit. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than before, stripped of its usual armor. Callum's answer came without hesitation. "Nothing," he said. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his coveralls and placed a small object on the desk between them, plain, gray, unremarkable in every way except for what it clearly contained. "But this," he said, tapping the drive once with a single finger, "will make you want to know the truth." The files on the drive told a story written in numbers, transfers, and shell corporations layered so deeply that even Vesper, with all her financial expertise, needed several minutes just to understand the shape of what she was looking at, her eyes scanning line after line of transactions that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. There were wire transfers routed through accounts in 3 different countries, each one designed to obscure its origin from the next. There were offshore holding companies with no employees and no purpose beyond moving money quietly from one hand to another, empty shells built solely to disappear the moment anyone looked too closely. And there were names, more names than she expected, some familiar from board meetings and charity dinners, most not, strangers whose signatures somehow carried weight inside her own company's private ledgers. But the file that mattered most, the one Callum insisted held the answer to everything, remained locked behind a password neither of them could guess on the first several attempts, no matter how carefully they tried. Only one person, according to the file's internal metadata, had ever been granted the authority to unlock it. That person was Vesper herself. She tried her birthday. She tried the founding date of Vale Dominion, the date she had once had engraved on a plaque in the lobby. She tried a dozen combinations pulled from the architecture of her own life, and each one failed in the same cold, mechanical way, the screen flashing red until the pattern felt almost cruel. Callum studied the underlying structure of the file rather than guessing blindly, running his eyes over the encryptions shaped the way he once studied blueprints for a living. After several minutes, he noticed something the encryption pattern seemed to be built around, not a date or a number at all, but a phrase, one that had appeared once before in an internal memo buried deep within the company's oldest archives, a sentence so ordinary it had escaped everyone's notice for years. Vesper read the fragment he pointed to and felt something shift behind her eyes, a memory surfacing from years earlier that she had long since filed away as meaningless, a phrase she had once written herself in the earliest days of the company. She typed the phrase into the password field with hands that were no longer entirely steady. The file opened. Inside was documentation stretching back nearly a decade, proof that Gideon Wren had been quietly siphoning influence and capital away from Vale Dominion through a series of maneuvers so gradual that no single year's audit would have flagged them as unusual, each individual transaction small enough to vanish beneath the noise of ordinary business. But as damning as the evidence against Gideon appeared, Callum noticed something in the structure of the transactions that troubled him even more than the betrayal itself, a pattern of authorization that pointed backward towards someone standing behind Gideon rather than beside him. Gideon was not the architect of this network. He was merely its most visible operator, a trusted face used to execute decisions made by someone standing further back in the shadows, someone Vesper had never once suspected of anything beyond generosity. When the name finally appeared on the screen, pulled from a signature buried in the file's final page, Vesper's face lost every trace of color it had left. "That's not possible," she whispered, staring at the screen as though the letters might rearrange themselves into something less devastating if she simply looked hard enough. Callum watched her carefully, giving her the space to absorb it before he pressed further. "You know him?" he asked. Vesper's voice, when it came, was barely more than a breath, thin and disbelieving. "He's the man who saved my company from bankruptcy," she said. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the hum of the monitors the only sound in the small technical room, both of them staring at a name that had rewritten years of memory in a matter of seconds. Vesper thought of every dinner she had shared with the man now implicated on her screen, every toast raised in his honor at company milestones, every quiet piece of advice she had accepted without question because she had trusted him more than almost anyone else alive. None of it had been what it seemed. And the realization moved through her slower than shock, closer to grief, the particular grief of losing a version of the past she had believed was solid ground. Callum let her sit with it, understanding better than most people ever could what it meant to have the floor of one's own life quietly removed. He had lived inside that same disorientation once, and he knew there was no shortcut through it, only the long, careful work of standing back up. The truth settled over the room slowly, reshaping everything Vesper thought she understood about the last several years of her life, every gratitude she had ever expressed now curdling into something she couldn't yet name. The man behind the bracelet, behind Gideon, behind the entire architecture of the attack, was not some anonymous rival lurking at the edges of her industry, easy to dismiss and easier to hate. He was someone she had trusted implicitly, someone she had credited publicly and often with rescuing Vale Dominion during its darkest financial hour, someone whose portrait had once hung briefly beside her own in a company newsletter celebrating a decade of survival. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet could have, because it came wrapped in years of gratitude she now had to question from the ground up, rebuilding a version of her own history that no longer made sense. Callum gave her only a moment to absorb it before speaking again, his voice steady, grounding her the way it had in the hallway hours earlier. "The whole attack," he said, "was designed to force you into signing that restructuring agreement." Vesper nodded slowly, the pieces finally aligning into a single coherent shape, ugly but undeniable. What their enemies did not yet know, Callum reminded her, was that the two of them had already uncovered the architecture behind the plan, an advantage that would not last if handled carelessly. That advantage, small as it was, could not be wasted on panic or premature confrontation. They agreed, without needing to discuss it at length, that the safest path forward was to appear as though nothing had changed, to walk back into the boardroom as though the hallway attack had never happened at all, as though the world still believed the wound had never been discovered. Vesper straightened her jacket, steadied her breathing, and led the way back toward the executive conference room where Gideon was waiting, unaware that his carefully constructed plan had already begun to unravel behind her calm expression. Gideon rose from his chair the moment Vesper entered, his expression arranged into practiced concern, the mask of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing trustworthy in every possible circumstance. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost gentle, laced with a warmth that now sounded to Vesper's newly sharpened ears entirely rehearsed. Vesper offered him a calm, composed smile, one that gave nothing away, drawing on every ounce of discipline she had spent a career perfecting. "Completely fine," she said. Callum remained a few steps behind her near the doorway, silent and unassuming, exactly as he had always positioned himself in every room he had ever quietly observed, a shadow no one thought twice about. Gideon's eyes moved toward him then, and for the first time since the two men had occupied the same building, their gazes met directly, holding for a beat longer than either wanted to admit. Neither one spoke, but something passed between them in that silence, an unspoken confirmation that each man understood exactly who the other truly was and what that recognition would ultimately cost. Callum saw the recognition flicker briefly across Gideon's face, a tightening around the eyes that most people in the room missed entirely, and he knew without a shred of doubt that Gideon understood his plan had already begun to fall apart. Still, Gideon pressed forward, unwilling to abandon a scheme this far along, unwilling to believe that a man in gray coveralls could undo years of careful work. He slid a leather folder across the table toward Vesper with the same practiced calm he had used 100 times before in 100 smaller negotiations that had all led quietly toward this exact moment. "It just needs your signature," he said, tapping the folder gently, his voice steady even as his fingers betrayed the faintest tremor. Vesper picked up the pen resting beside it, turning it slowly between her fingers, as though genuinely considering the document in front of her, letting the silence stretch until it began to feel unbearable. Behind her, Callum's eyes moved briefly to the clock mounted on the far wall. 20 seconds remained before the bracelet's hidden signal, still active on her wrist, would complete whatever function had been engineered into it. 20 seconds before everything either fell apart or came together, and no one in that room but Callum understood the clock was even running. Vesper lowered the pen toward the paper, her expression giving away nothing of the storm building beneath her calm exterior, every instinct she had honed over a career screaming at her to hold steady just a moment longer. The room held its breath around her, unaware of how close the moment had come to catastrophe, unaware that the next several seconds would decide far more than a single signature ever could. Then Callum's voice cut through the silence, low and unmistakable, carrying the exact weight it had carried in the hallway hours before. "Don't move," he said. Every head in the room turned toward him at once, startled by the sudden authority in a voice most of them had never heard before that night. Gideon rose halfway from his chair, his composure cracking for the first time that night, his hand twitching toward something beneath the table that he never quite reached. Callum did not raise his voice. He did not need to, letting the stillness of the room do the work for him. "Don't speak," he added. Vesper's hand froze above the page, understanding immediately what those words meant. Now that she knew the truth about the bracelet still circling her wrist, the device was transmitting exactly as Callum had predicted it would, the moment she stepped fully into the room's center, precisely where he had quietly guided her to stand only minutes earlier without her even noticing the choreography. He crossed the space between them in 3 unhurried steps and unfastened the clasp with a motion so practiced it seemed almost surgical, freeing her wrist from the bracelet before anyone else in the room had time to react or even fully understand what was happening. The instant the clasp released, the lights throughout the entire 47th floor died at once, plunging the conference room into darkness broken only by the pale glow of the city outside the windows, gasps rising around the table as chairs scraped against the floor. But Callum had prepared for exactly this outcome, and within seconds a small speaker concealed inside his jacket pocket crackled to life, filling the darkened room with sound that silenced every gasp instantly. Gideon's own voice emerged from the recording, unmistakable, cold, and utterly damning, caught in conversation with the very architect behind the entire scheme, discussing dates, signatures, and contingencies with chilling casualness. Vesper stood motionless as the recording played, every carefully rehearsed lie Gideon had told her over the years dissolving into nothing beneath the weight of his own words, each sentence landing like a small, quiet detonation. Gideon's composure shattered entirely, his hands trembling as the realization settled over him that he had, in essence, confessed to his own crime without ever intending to, his own recorded voice becoming the very evidence that would end him. Still, Callum was not finished. He opened one final file on the tablet in his hand, the last piece of evidence he had been saving, one that laid out the entire conspiracy from its earliest transaction to its final failed execution in that very room, leaving no room for denial or deflection. Gideon's voice, when he finally found it again, came out ragged and disbelieving, stripped of every ounce of polish it had carried moments before. "Who are you?" he demanded, staring at Callum as though seeing him clearly for the very first time. Callum met his gaze without hesitation, without triumph, only certainty. "The man you all tried to erase from the record," he said. Within days, Gideon Wren was arrested, and the financial network he had helped conceal for years began to unravel one shell company at a time, exposed in full to regulators who finally had the evidence they needed to act decisively rather than merely suspect. Vale Dominion narrowly avoided a hostile takeover that would have stripped Vesper of everything she had spent her career building, a fate the board would only fully understand months later when the details became public record. In the quiet aftermath, Vesper found Callum in the maintenance corridor where he still, out of habit more than necessity, continued his rounds, the cart with its squeaking wheel parked exactly where it always had been. She apologized to him plainly, without the polish she usually reserved for public statements, admitting that she had once looked at him and seen nothing more than an anonymous employee pushing a cart through her hallways, invisible in every sense that mattered to her at the time. Yet that same overlooked man had saved her life, her company, and very nearly her entire legacy in a single night, a debt she had no idea how to properly repay. Vesper offered him a senior position within a newly formed strategic security division, complete with a title, an office, and a salary that would have changed most people's lives overnight, the kind of offer few people in his position would ever refuse. Callum declined without a moment's hesitation, the answer already settled somewhere deep inside him long before she finished the sentence. He had no interest in wealth for its own sake, no desire to trade one kind of invisibility for another kind of spotlight, one just as capable of making him a target all over again. He wanted only the freedom to do work he believed in on his own terms, without answering to anyone whose judgment he didn't trust with the things that mattered most. "What is it you actually want, then?" Vesper asked, genuinely curious now, studying him the way she studied problems that refused to fit into familiar categories, the ones that usually turned out to be the most important. Callum considered the question carefully before answering, weighing the words the way he weighed everything. "The right to work without bowing to anyone," he said simply. Vesper smiled, something warmer than her usual expression, a rare softness crossing a face built mostly out of discipline, and offered him the chance to build an independent division from the ground up, one where he alone would hold final authority over every decision made within it. This time, Callum agreed. Weeks later, Callum walked through the main lobby of Vale Dominion Tower, no longer wearing grey coveralls, though he still carried himself with the same quiet economy of movement that had always defined him, unhurried, precise, entirely unimpressed by his surroundings. The people who once looked straight through him now stepped aside without needing to be asked, murmuring greetings he answered with little more than a nod, the same restrained courtesy he had always offered, even when no one bothered to return it. A young employee near the front desk glanced up as he passed, hesitating before speaking, uncertain of the correct title to use for a man whose story had already spread quietly through every floor of the building. "Sir, are you here to see the CEO?" the young man asked. Callum paused, glancing upward toward the 47th floor, where sunlight now spilled freely through windows that had once nearly cost Vesper her life, the glass replaced, but the memory of that night still etched into the building's bones. "No," he said, allowing the faintest trace of a smile to cross his face, the closest thing to humor he ever permitted himself in public. "I'm here to check on my building." High above, standing on the private balcony outside her office, Vesper watched him cross the lobby floor, small from that height but unmistakable, his posture carrying a quiet authority no title had ever needed to grant him, and understood something she suspected she would carry with her for the rest of her career. The man she had once dismissed as nothing more than a janitor had never actually been small at all. He had simply chosen, deliberately and for reasons that made perfect sense once she understood them, to move through the world as though he were invisible, a choice born not of weakness but of hard, expensive experience. The story ended as it had always been destined to, with Callum stepping into an elevator, the doors sliding shut between them with a quiet mechanical finality, the same doors that had once opened onto the most dangerous night of her life. Vesper remained on the balcony a moment longer, watching the space where he had been, the city stretching wide and indifferent beneath her. And for the first time in her life, the billionaire understood a truth that no amount of money had ever taught her, that some men need no power at all to command silence from an entire room. Somewhere below, in a corridor that would soon carry his name on a small brass plaque outside a door of his own choosing, Callum Rohr walked past the very spot where a bullet had once struck the wall beside him and did not slow his pace, did not glance at the patched glass, did not need to. He had already carried that night with him long enough. What mattered now was the quiet, ordinary Tuesday ahead of him. A building to check, a shift to finish, and no one left who could make him disappear simply by deciding he did not matter.